Welcome to another Chatterbox. Today we've got Emily Temple, founding director of ET Planning. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have someone from planning on the podcast. It comes up all the time on other podcasts we've done and with the sales team. When they talk about Box Plus, planning is always a hot topic, I want to say, when people are thinking about starting a self-storage business. So yeah, thanks for coming. And I'm sure we'll speak about some great stuff today and hopefully help people who are looking to start a self-storage site try what to think about really, and the key things they want to think about when they're starting with studio planning.
Indeed.
So let's get into it. Do you want to start with telling us a bit about ET Planning?
Sure. So we're based down in Berkshire and we've been operating for about 7 years or so. Projects that we get involved with, commercial, whether it's change of use of buildings or use of land, for all sorts of commercial enterprises. So that's been a big part of the business, as well as residential side of things as well.
Yeah. Have you had much experience with self-storage?
Yes. I mean, I've used self-storage myself, which is always handy. You get a good feel for things. Yeah. But yes, a variety of different planning proposals for self-storage, and also at all different scales. Sometimes it is just a case of homeowners perhaps wanting to have a container on their land, especially if they're not eligible for building because they're in a restricted area, but all the way up to the kind of commercial scale where you're doing double stacking, container storage. And then again, sometimes that can be for individual companies that want to rent out or own a whole space and operate their business from that location. Or it can be, obviously it's got one landowner and operator, but then each unit rented out to individuals as needed. Yeah.
How does a planning permission differ from 1 or 2 containers compared to 50 plus for a self-storage site, for example?
Sure. The difference would be whether the containers are ancillary to an existing use that's already happening on the land, or whether the storage is a new use in and of itself. So if there's something that's already happening on the land and you want to have a container just to store the tools that you already need for whatever the business operation is, then those kind of things would be ancillary. And the beauty of containers is that they're not buildings. Under planning terms, they fall as a use of land. So if you're putting containers onto a site that's in association with ancillary to an existing use, then typically you don't need planning permission. So it's really easy to just order the amount that you need, install them on the land, and away you go. But where the storage tips over into being a use of its own, which I would say you would typically think about if you are then renting them out to individuals or a different organization. And at that point, even if you've got other activities already happening on the land, you're then either asking for planning permission for a mixed use because you've got 2 or more things going on, or you're asking for a change of use just to storage from whatever was happening before.
So essentially, if you're renting out containers to a customer, you really should be going with planning.
Yeah, I think that would be sensible, unless there's already some operation on site that would be ancillary to that. You're already doing that kind of thing. Yeah. But typically, yes, you would need planning permission for that change.
A lot of people ask us, they want to dip the toes in. They want to start with maybe, 4, 6, 8, 10 containers. A lot of people ask at that point, do I need planning? And it's a bit of a grey area. Is it easier to ask for forgiveness or ask for permission?
I could never endorse that as a planner. Always ask for permission first. Enforcement can be so tricky. We can help with enforcement, but it's always tricky and it's always best to ask. I mean, the worst that would happen is you'd be asked to remove the containers. So whatever investment you've made into them, you'd be asked to take them away. That's, I guess, the worst case scenario. In terms of the number of units, it's not so much about the number of container units that you would have. It's about the amount of land that it would take over or the percentage of the site, what else is already happening on the land. So in order for storage to become its own, what we call a primary use in planning terms, it's got to have an assessment, a sort of fact and degree, how often people are coming and going. Is it accessible 24/7? At what point does it tip over into becoming its own use? And that's a really difficult planning question to answer, which is why we have to advise everybody on a sort of individual basis, because it does depend on what else is happening on the land already. Because in some instances, if there's a lot already going on, 6 containers might not be enough to constitute change of use into a storage use separately or as part of a mixed use of something else that's already going on. But if On another site, if there's nothing going on, a dozen containers might be enough to trigger that. So we have to look at each one individually.
Yeah. Would you say there's any big don'ts, basically, if you are gonna start with container storage?
Look first at what the land designations are. So the council websites, or if you ask us, we can help. We look at what the constraints on a site would be. So an example of that might be if you're in the green belt or if you're in a floodplain, that kind of thing. So we would always look at what the restrictions could be on development depending on those areas. On the positive side, if a site is in, say, a core employment area or core employment zone, they're sometimes designated as, those can be really good sites if they're vacant plots of land or they've got buildings on that could be demolished or converted for storage purposes. So those sort of designations would actually be really favourable if there's been something on the land before, or it's generally in an area where other people are running businesses. That's a good thing to look out for.
Okay, that makes sense. Double stacking is becoming more popular at the moment with topper units available now, where it's like a 20-foot with a corridor cut down the middle and you've got 2 storage rooms either side to maximise return. How does that impact planning?
So I would say the main things to be aware of is the visibility of the site from outside of the site. So double stacking is a really good way of making an efficient use of land. As you said, it increases the density, increases the revenue that the site can generate. So from that perspective, from an economic view, it's definitely a positive thing to be looking at. Subject to land levels, that could be something else worth looking at, because obviously you want to make sure that the land is going to support having that sort of double stacking and they're not going to be wonky. But I would say the main thing is just looking at how visible, because when you're increasing the height of development, then that is something that would be applicable. So look at what the boundary treatment is. Are there any trees? Is there scope to maybe do some planting around the edges of the site? That kind of thing can help to soften the appearance of the development, particularly if the site is in a more rural area. Other thing is probably trees, again, linked to the boundaries. How close would you be stacking containers to the boundaries? Are branches going to get in the way? Does it actually mean you need to site the containers a bit further away from the boundary in certain locations? So it's just things like that to think about. And regardless of whether you're double stacking or not, is having enough space between the containers so that you can actually maneuver around the site, get appropriate size vehicles in and out, that kind of thing.
If I've got a site and it's all single stacked and I want to go double stacked, but I've got planning permission for the bottom level, would I have to get planning permission again to go up again?
It would depend on what the planning permission specifically says. So if the planning permission just said use of land for storage or storage containers, crack on, because it's still a storage use. You're not changing that use. It's the same purpose. So that would absolutely be fine. If there is a condition on the planning permission that says, yes, you can have storage on this land, but it's subject to all of the containers being single story, then we would need to submit a planning application to vary that condition and to lift it. Subject to what the reason was for putting that condition on, we would need to look at whether we can increase the height across the whole of the site or whether only on part of it, because it might be to do with visibility from a particular public footpath or road or something like that. So an area of the site might be a bit more sensitive to another part, that kind of thing.
That makes sense. Great. Site signage and advertising. Is that something that should be considered in the plan application right at the start?
It can be done in both ways. Advertisement consent does typically need its own consent. It's a different statutory process, so you can submit separate advertisement applications. Sometimes if you're not quite sure what signage you want, then it's perfectly fine to put in your planning application for the storage first, get that secured, get the application underway, being built out, etc. And then at some point in the future, you can come back for the advertisement consent. Equally, you can apply for it all in the same application, and the council will then consider both. So both parts need to be acceptable in order for the whole planning permission to be granted. The sort of thing that councils will look for with the advertisements is how sort of tall an advert might be, particularly if you wanted a kind of totem type advert, whether it's illuminated, and if so, whether that's internally or externally illuminated, and then whether that illumination has any sort of highway safety harm. So we're looking at how bright it is, the colour Perhaps is it flashing? You know, all sorts of things people might want to do with their advertisements. The other thing to look at is what kind of advertisements are around the area. So again, if you are on a core employment area that you're looking at, there'll be plenty of other businesses with adverts. And so you'll get a feel for what else other people have achieved so that you can kind of copy what they've done or be in keeping with what is elsewhere. So that is definitely something to just look out for. But yes, it can be included in a proposal.
Would a container being stacked on another one with some logos on the side class as advertising?
I think it probably would.
Yeah.
There is something about adverts on vehicles not being included, which is why as you're driving along the motorways, you sometimes see old lorry bodies with an advert down the side because technically it's a vehicle, or you'll see a lot of people have the sort of car wrapping and they'll park their cars in strategic places. There are some adverts you can do without needing consent, but they're typically small and they're typically not high. They're not at first floor level. Once you start elevating an advert, you would typically need consent.
Yeah. So when you have done applications in the past for self-storage sites, what are some of the most common questions that people coming to you are asking?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, highways and traffic is the predominant issue because the site needs to be accessible. Subject to the type of storage, it might need to be accessible by quite large vehicles. We might need to look at doing tracking diagrams to make sure vehicles can get into the site around it. That's what I talked about with the spacing of the containers. And visibility displays from a site entrance. If you're having to create a new entrance onto a highway, we might need to look at the visibility displays to make sure that they're good enough for the vehicles coming in and out and that they can exit a site in a forward gear. So typically highways would be the most common question we're asked, but also that the council would want to make sure is acceptable. And on the applications that we submit, the most common bits of extra information that we might be asked for would be some of these sort of tracking drawings, diagrams to show that the access and the manoeuvring within the site is okay. If you've got a site that's previously been used for business before, then we can kind of do a comparison of previous movements with its old use versus the movements that might be expected with a proposed use. In the case of storage, if it is going to be accessible 24/7, it's then sort of having a look at what the anticipated movements could be around the clock. I would say the other thing would be looking at things like those designations and what the implication of those designations might be. So do we need to do drainage strategies, depending on whether the site is green at the moment or if it's been previously developed? We might need to do an ecology survey. And then that leads into something called biodiversity net gain. Have you heard of that?
Do you want to go into that a bit more?
Sure. So biodiversity net gain is something that the government has introduced as a mandatory requirement for many applications this year. And the requirement is to enhance the biodiversity, the ecology on a site by 10%. So what we would do is employ an ecologist to prepare a report that we would submit with a planning application, and it would look at the conditions of the site as it is at the moment, and then it would look for opportunities to enhance that biodiversity as a result of getting the planning permission. So there would normally be some extra planting that would need to be included, particularly if you have boundary hedgerows or boundary trees, and that's easy to sort of strengthen that existing treatment. It could be doing bat boxes and bird boxes and things like that.
I was going to ask if my site's just a massive concrete slab, basically, how do I get around that then? But
I mean, the easiest way of making sure that you accord with the biodiversity net gain is having a site that's been previously developed in some way. If you've got a site that's already hard standing, then that's fantastic, actually, because you're reusing that land and it's fairly reasonable to be able to get that 10%. The harder one is if you're looking at a site that is already a field, perhaps well planted out. You might need to have an area of land that's actually bigger than the land that you're developing for the self-storage so that you can compensate and provide the extra planting or the mitigation measures on the other part of the site that's not being developed.
That's just popped in my head, actually, because I was at the site the other week and they had solar on top. Does that fall into needing to get planning permission if I'm going to put solar panels on top of the containers, or could I just do that?
There are some permitted development rights for solar. Permitted development is where the government have given landowners rights to do certain things without needing to have planning permission from the local council. It is subject to various criteria, but there are some rights for the installation of solar. So we would need to have a look at that on an individual basis. That can include ground mount solar as well as on top of buildings.
What would you advise are some of the key things that self-storage should think about or have in place to get an application through first time?
So every council will have a list of reports and documents that they require for a planning application. It's called a validation list. That's something that we look at to make sure that we submit the relevant reports that a council is likely to have. Quite often, your application won't even get through to a planning officer if you don't provide the necessary information. So that's probably one of the important things to look for. Each council requirement will vary, both just council to council, but also depending on the area of the site. As I mentioned before, that might be an ecology report. It might be some form of transport statement or assessment. It could be a drainage report and strategy, particularly if you're laying down hard surfacing, that kind of thing. So we can prepare all of that information and get it submitted to the council so that hopefully they have everything they need to tick it off the list.
How long typically does a self-storage application take to get through review? In theory, they're quite simple. It's just containers on a land, really.
Indeed. It depends on the area of the site and the number of containers that you have. I mean, an average time would be somewhere maybe between 8 and 12, but 8 is a typical statutory time frame. Right now in 2024, there are a lot of councils that are struggling with resources, and we do sometimes find that applications go over that time period, particularly if they are consulting other external organisations like the Environment Agency. So we just keep in touch with the officers at the council, find out what's going on. Is there any amendments or extra information that's needed? Are they still waiting on these other external consultants to come back? And sort of agreeing new deadlines with the council officers if necessary. So I would say that the 8 weeks is a very good sort of ballpark to start with. And that's from when you submit the application and it's validated. So you've got to allow a bit of time for the application to be prepared in advance of that as well.
If I've got a large site, say it could take 200 containers, but I submit an application for 100, but then I think actually I want to put another 100 down. Where's the line to have to reapply for a planning? Is it just the land's got permission for storage, or do I have to, if I'm expanding, do I have to go again for planning?
That's a really good question. And there is something in planning legislation and case law that talks about the impact of intensification. And sometimes the intensification of development can be enough to trigger effectively a new change of use, even though it might be going from sort of storage to storage. If it's a very different type of storage or a much more intense type of storage, that can be enough. It might be that you want to increase the site area and the planning permission that's been given is for a particular area. There'll be a big red line that will be drawn around it. And if you want to expand that area further, then you would need planning permission to do that.
Yeah.
The existing permission should give you a clear idea of where the limitations are.
Okay. We've mentioned Greenbelt, which then leads me to think about a sector where self-storage is becoming more and more popular, and that's the agriculture sector. So we get a lot of farmers coming to us thinking that they want to de-risk more dependable income into the farm. So if I'm a farmer looking to maybe start self-storage, what are some of the key things from an agricultural point of view or a rural point of view, which they should really think about to basically get a successful planning application through?
So I think the first thing would be whether the storage is a farm diversification scheme to support an ongoing agricultural enterprise, or whether the landowner is actually looking to move away from an agricultural use and do the storage instead. So in both cases, you would need planning permission, but one is used more as a support for that agricultural enterprise, and business plans and things like that can show how the storage would feed into a farm diversification scheme. Whereas if you're moving away from farming sort of entirely agricultural use, then we're looking at a sort of self-supporting storage use and whether that's acceptable. The Greenbelt can be a tricky area to get planning permission in. It is more restricted, and there are restrictions at the government's level. They've written a document called the National Planning Policy Framework, which a lot of landowners may well have heard of. And that gives quite a closed list of what's possible in the Greenbelt. Particularly if there's buildings already on it, that can be quite useful because you can either convert a building for storage purposes, extend a building for storage purposes, replace a building for storage purposes. So it gives a bit more flexibility as to what might be possible. Typically in the Greenbelt, you're not allowed to build new buildings, although you can do for agricultural purposes. So that might bring in a bit of flexibility for a farm diversification scheme. Mm-hmm. But where containers are not buildings, and you can do a change of use of land, that's where the self-storage through containers can be quite useful in the Greenbelt. But it would just be a case of looking at what the policies and restrictions there are for the local council as well. Mm. It really is whether the use is supporting the farm in the same way that you might have a cafe or some sort of farm shop. Those are other farm diversification schemes. They bring in different revenue, but it's all about the holistic operation of the farm as a whole, whereas there are some that are just literally looking at a complete change of use of land, changing the operation, moving in a completely different direction. It can be quite appropriate in some locations, particularly, as I said, if there are other buildings and things like that on a site that you can redevelop over, or hard standing you can use, that kind of thing. Yeah.
We don't get many farmers come in to completely just change the farm into self-storage. They want to continue farming, but they just want a simple business that's going to run alongside the farm. And they might have, I don't know, a bit of wasteland, for example. They might want to plonk 100 containers down to. And that's what typically we see. They go, well, I've got that bit of land over there, it's not being farmed, not being used. Is that a bit difficult, or?
It's possible, definitely. We have done it. It's helpful to understand the sort of business case of the farm overall, and to explain why that area of land is no longer required and what it was used for previously. A yard or some hard standing that you can make sense of and make use of, that's really good. That's where it can be helpful to look at a sort of small storage area to start with, the sort of dozen containers that you mentioned earlier. Yep. That's a really good way of starting. And it's also a way that feels perhaps less intense as a form of development, or less impactful on the local environment. It can be easier to get the local authorities buy-in on it and get planning permission for it. And then if it's successful and it works, then it's a way of perhaps increasing that over time. So that might be where you introduce the double stacking, or you expand the area over time. In some council areas, it's easier to extend or expand something that they've already granted planning permission for, rather than introduce something new for the first time. So it can be easier to sort of start small and then gradually expand over time.
Yeah, makes sense. We've got some farmers who have got old turkey sheds or old sheds that aren't being used, and they want to put containers in them. If I've got a big old shed that I'm not using, I want to put containers in it for self-storage. Is that any planning to do that, or because it's going in a building, is it okay?
So you probably would do, yes, because again, you're changing the use from an agricultural use class to a storage use class for that particular building. There is something called prior approval for the conversion of agricultural buildings to industrial. And that can be a really good process to go through to establish a commercial use of a building. Then a planning application could go in for its use as storage or for its demolition and replacement. But having the prior approval secured for the change of use to an industrial purpose can be a really good, what we call a fallback position. It can be a really good opportunity to establish, from the council's perspective, an alternative to agricultural use on the land. And then it sort of paves the way, if you like, theoretically, for an alternative commercial use to then come forward. So we quite often, particularly in Greenbelt locations, we will look for these fallback positions.
And you mentioned highways can be a sticky point. Is there anything farmers should consider when they don't want people coming through the farm to access it and they've got to make another access point? Is there anything to consider there, or is it just a case of picking the more sensible point and just going through that planning application?
That's a really good question. Quite often when you have a new access point, you are separating the area of storage into its own planning unit. So a part of the site is then only being used for storage purposes. So it's not a mixed use as part of the wider farm. So it's really important to explain a planning application properly as to how it's going to operate, and the introduction of a new access can be one of those things. In general, the principle is okay, and in some instances, it might not even need planning permission. As I mentioned before, the most important thing is to look at the visibility splays. Are they good enough for the vehicles that you're going to be using? The second thing would be just to look at what the boundary treatments are. So if you're going to end up, decimating a lot of trees, particularly if they're protected, that's obviously going to be a no-no. Or if the trees are then in the way of the visibility splays, that can pose a bit of a problem as well. So we need to look at land ownership throughout the whole of the splay. Is it in the ownership of the farmer, the landowner, or is it in the highway, the council highways land ownership? That's what you want to see.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of rolls nicely into my next question is, how do you typically work with people? Do you have to do site visits? What's kind of the process if I wanted to establish a self-store site, basically?
We don't have to go to site. No, we do typically use Google satellite images, Street View, things like that. Photos and videos of sites are very helpful, particularly because we're based down in Berkshire. Depending on where the site is, it's just not feasible, for us to get to. But technology is a wonderful thing these days, and there's lots that we can do. So we don't have to come to site. We do always like to have detailed conversations or a video meeting in those instances with the landowner so that we make sure we understand what the aspirations are. And then we describe the planning application, the proposals properly. We coordinate and organise all of the necessary plans and reports that are needed. So we go out to the right people that we've worked with that can prepare the necessary documentation, and we collate all of that and submit that to the council. And then we act as the planning agent, as the point of contact for the local authority, so they can ask us if they've got any questions or comments as we go along.
Pretty simple process, which is, I'm sure, what everyone wants to hear. Can you explain what a certificate of lawfulness is? Because I have no idea, but I've been asked to ask this question.
It's a good question, because it's the side of planning where you don't actually need to ask for permission. You're asking the local authority to confirm that what you want to do is already lawful. An example of that might be this ancillary storage use. So if the containers are being placed on the land to store equipment or plant materials in association with what's already going on there, then you can ask for a certificate of lawfulness to confirm that that is ancillary. On the flip side, if a use has been happening that should have had planning permission, but perhaps did not, and a period of 10 years has passed, then that use would be immune from enforcement action. And so you can apply for a certificate of lawfulness with the evidence to show that the area of land has been used for storage for that period of over 10 years. And the council would then grant a certificate of lawfulness if your evidence is good enough.
Okay.
It's really good to do, particularly if you're looking at selling land and it has been used in a certain way and you realise that actually it could be lawful. It's very good to get that certificate of lawfulness. It'll help you sell the land. It's also the sort of thing that solicitors ask for when they're doing their conveyancing. They want to make sure that everything is rubber stamped that's going on a site. Yep. So it's a good thing to look at doing.
Great. Makes sense. Do you have any examples of self-storage operators who haven't got it right the first time and have had to retrospectively attempt permission?
Yes. And this is where perhaps a site has a mixed use. So there's a few different things going on. So if a landowner has entered into a development without having the planning permission and then they realise that they need it, then submitting a retrospective application would be the correct way to try and regularise that development. If the council invite an application, that's very good. If they don't, there is an entitlement to submit the application anyway. There is also a right of appeal should the council refuse the planning permission. So there is a process that can go through in order for that landowner to retain the development that they have entered into and try to sort of follow the procedure through as far as possible to retain it.
No, that makes sense. I think we've covered so much there from a planning point of view and really good points there and from an agriculture point of view as well, which really helps us because we do a lot with that sector. I just want to say thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Absolutely amazing. One we've been looking forward to, definitely, to get someone from planning to come.
Well, I hope it's been helpful.
No, it's been really good. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Chatterbox was brought to you by Cleveland Containers, the UK's leading supplier of new and used shipping containers and the largest supplier to the container self-storage market. If you're looking to enter the self-storage industry or streamline and expand your current site, talk to us about Box Plus, our one-stop service that can provide you with everything you need to set up and run a simple, remotely operated and profitable self-storage business. For more information, head to clevelandcontainers.co.uk and follow us on social media for more content on all things shipping containers and self-storage.